Okay, I forgot. So good afternoon again, everyone. We are EMAV, and my name is Loïc Pavard. So the business case that I want to explain this afternoon was basically the following, if I have to do an outline. It was making a punctual inspection and detection of regulatory breaches and quality control regarding certifications of tree pruning and trimming activities. And again, this will be a good link with what Dr. Kato just illustrated before. We did this for a client, a customer, which is VSGO. They do generation and distribution and sale of power and gas, serving more or less 700,000 customers in Spain and Portugal. Just a few words about the current situation regarding trimming and pruning activities within power lines, operation and maintenance sector. It might not be clear to everyone, but it seems that a lot of those companies spend more or less half of their budget with this kind of checking the existence of proximate vegetation close to the electrical network, and that can affect this electrical sector. The current situation is that what they have to do to check and verify that this vegetation cannot affect in a too deeply manner. Well, they don't use particular tool to identify this area and priorities. They usually have to walk and do visual inspection, or if they have to use other means, they actually use helicopter or planes, and this can be really costly. So we immediately see that the UAV can obviously bring some interesting feature here. And the risks actually are various and diverse because, well, obviously there's the risk of potential hazard or electrocution when there is a direct contact from vegetation to the wired lines, for example. There's the risk of fires or injuries, and obviously the risk of disruption of service, which for an electrical distributor can be of a big impact. The expected point cloud density was 10 to 15 points per square meters, which obviously could be done by a surveyor without any difficulty. The topographic accuracy was 20 centimeters in absolute coordinate. The customers expected us to capture all elements within an exhaustive acquisition, tower structure, power cables, insulators, etc., and especially crossing lines also. This is something that I will be speaking afterwards. We had to inspect various corridors. The width was between 15 meters to 40 meters for the largest one. We had to maintain a continuous and homogeneous data acquisition to ensure visibility of every cables and crossing lines, etc. Monitor the temperature of the different elements at any time, and the expected geodetic datum was UTM ETRS 89. So obviously to monitor the temperature, you understand that more than the LiDAR, we also had to embed a thermographic camera, a visual camera. So we had a complete UAV respecting those requirements, obviously. So the minimum expected corridor width, as I told you before, according to the customer requirements, was 15 meters. In some places where there were not particular elements on the ground, we achieved 180 meters of width for the corridor mapping with this surveyor, flying more or less at a height of 20 meters above the wires. Okay, so it. Depending on the height of the wires, it can represent maybe 40, 50 meters. As you can see on this kind of image, we were successful into analyzing, for example, checking the minimum distance compliancy at every crossing line areas, which was one of the customer requirements. At some points, a tower would receive two different line crossing, and it is important for them to check that there was no movement or that the distance at which the cable is crossing on the tower is respecting the regulations. So then, after obtaining the last files, when you start analyzing them, obviously, you start to be able to do this kind of activities, calculating tree pruning and trimming volumes to make sure, for example, that in case of wind or because of vegetation too close to the electrical network, we can recommend them more or less the volume that they should be thinking about trimming. So that they get sure they stay and they remain into the regulation. We can also identify the site fall areas, meaning when there is steep, the fact that a tree could fall on the floor on the ground could affect the architecture, the structure, and this is also something that we are able to identify and to put in evidence with this kind of point cloud files. So checking and detecting non-compliant distances between vegetation and power cables, bring some more additional value using predictive models of vegetation growth, and this is something that we've spoken before, and I will just illustrate after this. Also, we show here that even if the point cloud file will give us the situation of a wire at some point, we have to take into account that an electrical cable has a natural movement because of natural climatic conditions, and this has also to be taken into account when you make this kind of a non-compliancy checking distance with the proximate vegetation, for example. This is an example of the point cloud file that we generated. Here we are seeing specifically a crossing line between a high power voltage crossing line and a medium voltage line. With the wires are actually thinner in this case, and one difficulty that we may also face with LiDAR is the capacity for the LiDAR to detect both the wires of high voltage and the medium ones. So we had to find the proper density to be able to focus on both kind of electrical lines. I just want to share with you a few market trends that we estimate for the next upcoming years within trimming and pruning activities. So it seems that the data acquisition sensors and operation for this kind of activity can be really done with LiDAR sensors. Obviously, in some very large area or large surface to cover, maybe the helicopter would be more economical than the UAV if you have to fly maybe 200 kilometers to make a really large survey. But the UAV can also be a very great tool to access to zone presenting orographic complexity. Then it seems that the use of public reference vegetation database is something that we will see in the next upcoming years. This is also something that Dr. Cato just illustrated before. The implementation of big data and predictive model can really support those customers in terms of supporting their in terms of planning their trimming and pruning campaigns. And also, obviously, if we can support them in planning those campaigns, it will be translated into a decrease in costs for those activities. And this represents what we've been working on after this operation for Viesgo. Today, you have several kind of satellite images that have covered the whole planet, representing the land cover on our planet. And then we have decided to use this kind of information as a first step to identify the zones or the area where those electrical distributors, those power grid actors, should put their focus on in function of the kind of vegetation you have on the ground, etc. A second step that we can do after taking into consideration those public database vegetation is adding to this information data collection from the field with the UAV. So the UAV will here with the LiDAR, for example, bring some more accuracy to those kind of database, will allow us to do visual and thermographic inspection, etc. And at EMAV, we also beneficiate and we also take advantage of the all the expertise that we have within the precision farming, because it allows us to use the growth model vegetation that we have already elaborated to then be able to deliver to our customers some risk model. Risk model, I'm speaking about being able to cartography for them and identify for them the risk of disruptive service at some point. So it can be one color here. The risk of triggering a fire because there is vegetation too close to a wire, for example, or the risk to not comply with the regulation, for example. I do thank you for your attention.